when we talk about international coordination on the ground level, this is the most unexamined, unevaluated space in aid discourse right now. Because over the last 20 years, we've seen, by different names, by different configurations, a model that's been tried in places that are of intense interest to the US government. Afghanistan, Liberia, Haiti, Somalia. And we have not put it into a doctrine, either internationally or within US framework. And that's what needs to happen next. So in the short paper that I did, I tried to lay out the basic model that we see recurring over the last 20 years. It has a high-level group for political dialogue with government, with donors, with some key implementing partners, with some representatives of civil society. It has a sector level where ministers can convene their group of partners, both operational and financial, to really figure out what's the sector policy in this space. Oftentimes, that level gets obscured by pooled funds, which become the visible tip of the iceberg. But underneath it is a real sense that you have to take sector policies and figure out what does the government want to do in health or infrastructure or economy, and then how can the work of the US government, the UN, and others help do that. And it's not meant to be a straitjacket where we try to take coordination and make everybody fit into this interdependent model. It's rather meant to be a space where you can say, this is where we're trying to collectively sense make what's going on, where does this sector need to go relative to others, and then how can our programs unilaterally support that bigger cause. And below that level is a secretariat, which is usually run by the Ministry of Planning, but staffed with international experts. I highlight in the paper the Somalia experience because I think it's so important. It's a place where you're starting with international coordination from a very low starting point with the government capacity and with extreme difficulties in terms of conflict and disaster and weak institutions, broken social cohesion, a tenuous political settlement. And I cite some reports in the document, as well as a podcast that we did at the Center for Global Development with Bella Bird, who's the former country director of the World Bank for Somalia, and one of the economic advisors to the Prime Minister of Somalia. And you get a sense looking at this literature that it was this international body, this mechanism of a high-level peace, sector groups, and a secretariat that changed, that made basically prevention and development something that was a project before and kind of disjointed into a change management process. They created a center of gravity for moving forward. And you'll hear in Bella's comments and in the Prime Minister's rep, at the beginning, the donors all crowded in to this space, and the government had a very weak starting point, didn't know what priorities to assess, didn't know how to articulate it. But in the streamlined place of this mechanism, over time, the government has now been able to articulate its own development plan, often coming to donors afterwards. It's been able to create its own National Security Council and a Development Council. The Development Council actually takes line ministries and local representation and brings it in, but these are government-only bodies that interface by virtue of this platform. So there's been a learning by doing experience. So it's very fundamental to look at it. And you'll see again in the literature, it's really been attributed to a majority of how this place has turned around very slowly. The steps ahead are enormous, but you have a starting point now from which to then now decentralize that work more. In Haiti, on the other hand, you didn't have that. You had a very high-level group where you had a former US president as the envoy for Haiti on behalf of the UN. You had the prime minister, you had a very rigorous high-level body trying to figure out how to move Haiti forward after the earthquake. And you had a very high-level secretariat with the US supporting the executive director from the government side and the EU supporting the deputy. But you did not have the sector groups, the ministries leading their own partners across all the various key pillars of the response. And that led to huge problems because it all became a very projectized approach. The ministries cried foul that this was a parallel government system that they were not included or accommodated in. So all that to say, we need a doctrine. We need to learn from experience how to make these things work well. And we also have to learn from the Haiti experience as well as the Somalia one, how to better integrate a whole of government approach. You know, you had the special coordinator for State Department at the higher level group in Haiti. Then you had no place for USAID and others to talk about sector policy. It went right down to the Ministry of Planning and the Secretariat that were just looking at projects, not trying to incorporate them within sector policies. And you had 7-hour meetings with the Prime Minister and Bill Clinton and others sitting there trying to adjudicate what project to fund over 7 hours. That is not efficient. That is not adaptive. So all that to say, I think there's a model there to learn from. It's in the paper. And there's some key experiences to learn from as well, starting with Somalia. There are 3 other pieces that I talk about in terms of how to operationalize coordination as part of a new way of working. The first has been intimated a bit by Sam and Laura, union and approach on resilience. Now, it's not your grandparents' resilience. I mentioned in the paper that resilience really in the US context is a food security thing, but it's grown enormously from there. Now it's really about identifying complex interacting risks in the context and trying to mobilize capacities, not just for life-saving needs in the humanitarian space or developmental needs for consumption and poverty reduction and growth. It's how do you manage these complex interacting risks of debt burden, of climate change, of pandemics, etc. You have to begin to see resilience as looking at complex interacting risks and how they can exacerbate and compound conflict factors, and managing those risks across a cycle from prevention to crisis response and then transformation, but also thinking that any of these risks, whether they're so-called natural disaster or conflict related, are in essence political, because it's the exclusion of certain groups from social safety nets, from services that makes them vulnerable. So start thinking about resilience in a much more strategic way. The Pathways report for peace that the World Bank did with the UN says resilience is the primary or the best means of prevention. The State Department's recent Strategic Prevention Initiative builds resilience in as a key pillar, and I think those are extremely forward-looking things to do. And UNDP's work on Syria, looking at a resilience approach, is again very forward-looking. This is where we need to be thinking. The second piece is about adaptive management. You can't say, here are the complex problems, here's the complex political economy, let's get everyone together in a coordination mechanism and think about prefix solutions with prefix timelines and metrics over 2 to 3, 4 or 5 years if you're lucky with a DFAT, and think that's can't change at all. You need to make it shock responsive, but you also have to make it responsive enough to be able to refine it and implement it over time. Because you're going to learn more things about the political economy as you go. You're going to learn more things about the actors, who are the real people we should be trying to support, how can we reallocate funding as necessary. USAID is, I think, leading the way in thinking about this. From complexity-aware theories of change to the refine and implement approach where you get funding and you have a year or so to really validate the theory of change and move it forward, right down to adaptive procurement, thinking about how to make procurement officers on the front line much more adaptive. That's also a piece in State Department's Strategic Prevention Initiative, the adaptive, but it's going to take some heavy lifting and some risk appetite. I think it's one of, and I say in the paper, it's one of the most important clauses in the GFA Act. It's a move to adaptive work. And there's a clause that says, you know, if you're having trouble doing adaptive work, come back to Congress. If you need more flexibility, come back and talk to us. This is exactly what MCC has been doing in the past. They get money, but they don't get an earmark to go do a specific project. They're allowed to go there with space to try and figure out what they should be doing. The last piece that I say in the paper is around what are we going to do with the private sector. It's in the Stabilization Assistance Review. It's in the Cameron Commission report. Building the private sector helps to stabilize a country. The problem is that oftentimes it's about one-off deals. We go there and we try to make one-off deals with certain firms and think that that's going to create a catalyst. The World Bank's IFC did a really interesting report last year with Paul Collier on supporting pioneering firms. And the logic behind it is, don't just start with a one-off deal here or there. Start with trying to support the fixed costs and risks of some pioneering firms that can grow a sector and follow them along, support their efforts to figure out what kind of regulations are needed for these corporations, what kinds of civil society arrangements, what kind of collective ecosystems for cluster economies are needed or value chains, and build those out. Because the premise is you don't know these things ahead of time. You have to work adaptively through it. And in order to do that, you need a higher sense of coordination between the DFIs, the development finance institutions, to really get together. And these coordination platforms provide that. So as the new Development Finance Corporation starts to get its legs, as MCC tries to figure out more how to expand into what it calls vulnerable countries, they should be key players in these platforms to think through these new approaches. So I talked a little bit about that in the paper as well. But the other thing to know is that these are not theoretical exercises. These are things happening on the ground. And the question is, how do you bring whole of government approaches into them? The Center for Global Development did a piece on US development assistance in fragile states last year, which I think draws a lot on USIP's task force report, and it affirmed the value of creating these kind of coordination mechanisms. The G20 is now working on country platforms in fragile states. David Malpass from the World Bank has committed to 11 pilot projects for these country platforms, starting with Ethiopia and Kenya and others. How is the US going to build itself into this program through a whole of government approach? And we're also seeing UNDP, for example, committed to country platforms in their strategic plan, which is cited in the paper as well. So now is, I think, a time to really sink in on the doctrine and thinking about these new ways of working across the resilience spectrum, the adaptive, and rethinking development financing.